Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of Hammer Time. As always, I'd like to begin with a heartfelt thank you for those of you who have become regular listeners and watchers, and also for everyone who leaves comments and ideas and suggestions. I read all the comments. I try to reply and react to as many as I can, but I have to admit I'm in the lucky position. They are becoming so numerous that it's becoming harder and harder for me to reply to each one, but I read them all and I take your criticism, I take your compliments, and I will always try to make this a more comfortable and more intriguing and more interesting program for you. So rest assured that everything is being read, and I apologize if I cannot always reply directly. This week is a very special episode. It's going to be the traditional Hammer Time with me. And then towards the end of today's show, we have the fantastic Substackers from Doomberg. We're going to talk about geopolitics. We're going to talk about energy politics. We're going to talk about the future of the West. We're going to talk about the future of industry. So I think it's going to be very interesting. Those of you who don't know Doomberg, I really highly encourage you to take a look at the conversation. You're going to love it. They are fantastic. It's a kind of fact-based conversation, but it shows that even facts can come with flavor. So I think you're going to enjoy it quite a bit. And as always, on Monday, the full conversation will be published over at Brussels Signal, which I also highly encourage you to check out. It's a wonderful new publication. The attempt is to become somewhat of a right-of-center Politico, so to be serious, to present the facts, but to kind of show them from a right-wing perspective. So I think you're going to enjoy their reporting, their commentary as well. Now, today I want to start with kind of the overarching theme, which is who's going to protect us from our politicians. And there is one picture that I always enjoy very much. It's a black and white drawing from the early 20th century, actually. And it shows the Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria shaking hands with the then former president of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. So this was taken in 1910. And they met, actually. Not a lot of their communities and conversations is left, but apparently both of these men had a soft spot for each other. So the president of the United States and the Emperor of Austria-Hungary at the time kind of were related to each other in great sympathy. And during this meeting, Theodore Roosevelt asked the emperor, what's the meaning of a monarch in the 20th century? Kind of what's the point of a monarchy in these modern times? And I think the emperor gave a very good answer that I'd like to read to you in full. He said, "It is my duty to protect my peoples from their politicians." And I'm very often wondering these days, well, who is protecting us from our politicians these days? And I know this might sound a little bit like hyperbole. What do you mean by this? Aren't our politicians, aren't they our elected representatives? Aren't they our voice in public? Aren't they those who act on our behalf? But let's be very serious and honest about this. How many of you do genuinely feel that those in power, those in politics, that they act on your behalf? That they feel that your needs, your interests are at the heart of their actions? I mean, very often it seems that they pursue goals that either serve their own interests or some beyond, some idea, some ideological goal that is beyond what actually matters for you in your daily lives, right? We saw this during COVID. We saw this during the migration crisis. We see it now in the realm of economics. So who is there? Who is going to protect us from our politicians? I'll have a special segment in the upcoming weeks about whether or not monarchical systems might be better than their reputation. Now, full disclosure here, I have somewhat of a soft spot for the Habsburg and the Habsburg dynasty in general, but I think as an Austrian, this is understandable. But I believe that not everything that these old monarchs, the perception they had of the world was entirely wrong, right? In their worldview, and if you read some of the literature from that period, for them governing, for them ruling, was a duty. It was an obligation. It was almost a burden, if you want. It was a privilege. It was not something they felt entitled to. And I mean, this brings me to something that I'm sure that many of you have followed, and this was this letter written by the EU Commissioner Thierry Breton to Elon Musk a couple of days ago, where more or less this EU Commissioner, and the very term Kommissar, Commissioner, kind of is resembling the kind of verbiage they also used in the Soviet Union. But this idea that there is this commissar who was not really elected, nobody voted this guy into office, yet he felt the need to send a letter to Elon Musk and remind him that when he has a conversation with Donald Trump, that he must be very careful about disinformation and misinformation, and if not, then something else might happen. So they might sue him, they might ban him, because you cannot allow the European public to be exposed to a conversation between an American citizen and the owner of X, the platform, and a former and currently running US president, somebody running for the office of the US president. So there needs to be somebody who takes care of what the European people can be exposed to, because they're too dumb, they're too immature, they're too stupid to follow such a conversation. So this is kind of the problem. We have a political class that has all the negative attitudes of the monarchical system, but none of their sense of duty and none of their sense of obligation. I find it a little bit ironic, just as I digress a little bit, I hope you can forgive me. During the opening ceremony at the Olympic Games, they redid the beheading of Marie Antoinette and the French Revolution. And I was wondering if the people like Macron, like von der Leyen, like this Breton guy in Brussels, whether they actually realize that in the potentially coming new revolution, they're gonna be the Marie Antoinettes. They're gonna be the Louis XVI. And I hasten to add, I mean this in a metaphorical sense. So I know I'm not advocating that anybody is put under the guillotine. I'm not advocating or inciting violence. I want to make this very clear. But it seems odd that just as Marie Antoinette, although I think that she was much better than her reputation, but that Marie Antoinette or Louis XVI, the claim that was so often made is that they were entirely detached from what was going on in broader French society at the time. And I think the same thing applies very much to contemporary European or Western politicians as well. Now, apparently, somebody within the Brussels and European bureaucracy has a shred of intelligence left. And so Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, is, according to the Financial Times, she slapped down Thierry Breton over harmful content letter to Elon Musk. This was the headline of the Financial Times. So apparently even she realized that a self-delusional, self-aggrandizing EU bureaucrat has to be a little bit careful in what he's saying. But my sense is still, it's not that what he was saying was so much the problem. I think it was the way in which he said it. The desire of the Brussels bureaucracy, the desire of the British bureaucracy, even in the United States, to curtail free speech, to limit the flow of information, to regulate and control the internet. That is a real thing, right? This is something that is happening. We know from the Twitter files. Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi have done yeoman's work in working through all these files. We know now that both Barack Obama and Joe Biden, their governments, were leaning on social media in order to suppress information. Think of the Hunter Biden laptop that they didn't like and amplify information that was very often wrong. Again, think about the Hunter Biden laptop and the 50 intelligence specialists who said, oh, this looks like a Russian disinformation, like a Russian operation. Or you see the same now with the riots in the UK, where you have these headlines that say, oh, this is Vladimir Putin has his hand behind this. So this has nothing to do with any kind of justified grievance on behalf of the British people. They're all just puppets in the grander scheme of Russia. Now, the other problem I see is, of course, that it's no wonder that these bureaucrats are completely isolated from everyday life, because if you look at the current people running on the presidential tickets, and we have a wonderful graph here on the public sector and the private sector experience that these people have. Now, if you look at the age, kind of from age 20 to age 70, I mean, Donald Trump actually has private sector experience, right? This is a man who actually did something in his life, in his private life. He was a well-known figure before he entered politics. But then if you look like somebody like Kamala Harris or Tim Walz, they basically have worked in government or adjacent to government their entire life. So it's very odd, right? The idea that people who never did anything within the private sector are supposedly the most qualified to tell the private sector what they have to do. And I think this attitude that we see in so many bureaucracies all around the West, right? That those who never did a single day's work outside of government still believe that they know best how life outside of government is supposed to work. And I think this is a dangerous delusion. It reminds me of a famous saying by Bismarck. I'm feeling very 19th century today. So Bismarck once said, if you have good bureaucrats, good civil servants, you can govern a country even if it has the worst laws. But it says, if you have bad bureaucrats, if you have a bad public service, even the best laws cannot rescue your country. And I think this is a little bit what we see nowadays happening as well. What's the point of the First Amendment in the United States? What's the point of freedom of speech in the United Kingdom? What's the point of freedom of conscience and freedom to publish what you think in Germany? When the government, when public bureaucrats, when they simply ignore it, right? There is no point in having the best laws, the freest laws on the books, if those who are in charge of enforcing them, of guarding them if you want, have no interest in doing so. Accordingly to the law, right, in the United States, people have a right to a speedy trial. Now, we are constantly reminded of the horrific events of January 6th. There are still people who participated in what happened on that day who are waiting for their trial, right? They are basically held for 3 years without bail, and they wait for a trial that seems never to come. In what way, in what sense is that the right to a speedy trial? So the laws might be amazing on the books, right? My American friends always say, oh, America is not a democracy, it's a republic, and they waive their constitution, and that's all fine. But what's the point of the constitution if no court, no public servant, if nobody's willing to uphold it? What's the point of the tradition of free speech in the United Kingdom if no public servant, if the police, if the Metropolitan Police, if Keir Starmer, you name it, if nobody cares about it? Right? And this goes back to what Bismarck meant. Like, it's one thing, you want to have something on the books, if you will. But there is no point in having the best laws if you don't have the civil service to go with it. And I think this is something that we have to talk about in greater detail. And you see this, right? I mean, the way in which governments in the West, and I've been talking about this on previous shows, and I will talk about this again in future shows, but I don't want to overdo it because I don't want to bore you kind of with the same story over and over and over again. But here's a quote from David Cameron. I think that just in many ways describes the kind of derogatory attitude many members of the political class have for their people. So let me read this out to you. This is from David Cameron. He said, "Not for the first time, I found myself thinking that it is mainstream Britain which needs to integrate more with the British Asian way of life, not the other way around." Right? And this is, again, precisely the kind of attitude I meant before. So this is that you, the people, are at fault, not the politicians, not the media. You, the people, are the ones who always get it wrong, and you just don't understand that those in charge and those in power, they just have the best intention, and you're just too stupid to get it. You see this, by the way, also in the way how they talk about themselves. Right? When you think about whether it was Joe Biden doing the economy, you see it was also Olaf Scholz in Germany, and you also saw it with Rishi Sunak in the UK, when they said, we need to communicate better, right? We need to make a better way to highlight our successes. I mean, this is just a euphemistic way of saying, you, the people, are too stupid to understand how great we are. And if you don't understand it, if you are just too dumb, then maybe you should not have any say in politics at all. And this is, I think, where the journey is going. We have created this odd idea that tyranny, dictatorial systems, totalitarianism, it only starts at the Hitler and Stalin level, and everything below it is quote-unquote fine. But it isn't. Right? You can wake up one day in a tyranny that is not yet having brown shirts marching through the streets, that is not opening gulags, but you can be on a journey kind of where the end point potentially is that, right? If you, for example, look again at the United Kingdom at the moment. So shortly after the new government was sworn in, they said, we have to release prisoners because prisons are overcrowded, we have no space for people in prisons. Yet, apparently, you can let violent criminals back out into the streets. But now you have space for people that post something offensive on Facebook, that post something offensive on Twitter. And this is kind of this negative attitude, this disparaging attitude towards your own population, towards your own people. And the wish, which is even more critical, I believe, the idea, as Breton says, as Starmer says, as everybody thinks to believe, that you can control hate, that the government can control people's emotions. What does that ultimately mean? The very idea, the very concept that the state will tell you what to feel. I'm asking you, as my viewers, how much more totalitarian can it get? Right? The idea to tell people what to feel about something. And if you don't feel the way the government tells you, then you need to be arrested. Then you need to be put in prison. Next week, which I'm also kind of very much looking forward to, so I want to give a little bit of a preview. Next week's guest on my show will be Konstantin Kissin, and we will talk about what this has, for example, done to comedy. Because the government also likes to tell you which jokes you're supposed to find funny, right? They also want to tell you where you're supposed to laugh. And this is one of the reasons why we ended up in a time there is no longer any genuine comedy. Stephen Colbert, you name them, right? And all these late night hosts, if you look at their shows, they give you applause lines, right? People applaud when they say something like, orange men bad or far right dangerous, whatever it currently is. But it's not a genuine humorous thing, right? The beautiful thing about humor is it creates an involuntary reaction. If somebody tells you a funny joke, maybe it's potentially somewhat of an inappropriate joke, you just start to laugh because you cannot help yourself. That's the point. It's funny, right? It makes you laugh. Like it's a reaction where kind of for a short amount of time you lose control over yourself. But that can be very freeing. Again, humor is a very freeing thing, which is why in almost every dictatorial totalitarian regime, one of the first things they crack down on is humor, right? There was no comedy under Stalin. There was no comedy under Hitler. There was no comedy in any totalitarian system for that very reason. Because humor, involuntary laughter, is something the government cannot control. So they want to control what you find funny. They want to control what you hate. And at some point, you truly end up in a quasi-totalitarian system. Again, it might not be Hitler. It might not be Stalin. But it also won't be a free society. So I think we have to be very vigilant in that respect. Now, and we see this also, by the way, in very often the way politicians talk about things and what they really pursue. Now, if you look at this graph from the 2024 general election in the UK and who voted for whom. Now, the Labour Party, which supposedly is like the socialist party, I'm exaggerating here, or the socialist-leaning party in the UK, which is the working class party. I mean, they have the word Labour in their very name. I mean, if you look at this graph, right, they are strongest, they are 40% in the income group of £70,000 plus, whereas under £20,000, they have 33%. So the working class is shifting conservative, right? The working class is shifting to the right because they understand that socialism, left-leaning ideologies, environmentalism, the Greens, Labour, you name it, they are left-wing, they are luxury beliefs, right? The issues, the problems, the things that they believe are important, they are very crucial, they're important for a very small sliver of society. They're important for the high-income sliver, but very often no longer for the average person. But of course, that very small sliver has disproportionate power in society. I find it ironic. We have so often this conversation in economic terms about the 1%, right? That 1% owns, however much of the income in the UK or the United States. But we never talk about how a very small sliver has complete dominance in the information sphere, right? You never talk about that there's almost a monopoly of left of center and far left ideas that dominate the universities, that dominate academia, that dominate the cultural sphere, right? We never talk about that quote-unquote 1%. We always talk about the rich. But what about those who are rich in the sense of that they dominate the public discourse? Like until very recently, you could not talk about migration. You could not talk about the issues of lack of cultural cohesion. We have new polls that show that social trust, like, do you trust your neighbors? Like, it's declining in the US. It's declining in continental Europe. It's declining in the UK. And the reason for this is the entirely wrong mantra that diversity is our strength. It is not. Diversity is a weakness, right? There's a different diversity of ideas, a different topic. But the idea that you just pull together people that have all kinds of different cultural backgrounds, all kinds of different values, that if you just put them together, they're going to be significantly stronger and better. It's an absurd idea. Sure, I will grant you that a couple of years ago, there were in Europe and in the West in general fewer stabbings. Machetes were less common in our streets. Now you could say our society has become significantly more diverse because these things didn't exist before that. But did our society get better for it? Is diversity truly always something that makes you better? Or is it in fact something that if done wrong, and I think we're doing it wrongly in the West, is it something that actually weakens you? And the reason why I ask this question is we hear a lot in the media that the European Union will fall apart if we are not careful about those darn right-wingers, that it's right-wing, far-right extremists that are the biggest threat to the European Union. But I want to show you a quick headline from our friends over at Visegrad 24 about what's currently going on between Denmark and Sweden. So I'm just going to read it to you real quick. Denmark is considering reintroducing border controls on its border with Sweden due to the gang crime spiraling out of control in its neighboring country. The statement was made by Justice Minister Peter Hummelgaard after 3 Swedish teenagers were brought to trial in a single week, suspected of perpetrating gang shootings in Denmark, and another 2 men were caught after a bomb attack in Denmark. So this is what's going on. So mass migration has triggered gang violence in Sweden, and that gang violence is now spilling over into neighboring countries. So those neighboring countries, in this case Denmark, says, you know what, we're going to close our borders. We don't want this to spill over. So it's not the crazy right-wing Sweden Democrats or the crazy right-wing Social Democrats in Denmark that are tearing the European Union apart. It's the fact that those countries that still have a certain degree of social cohesion want to shield themselves from those countries who have pursued policies that is destroying their social cohesion, that is destroying their cultural homogeneity. And of course, you see the same with Hungary. You see the same for now with Poland. We see how this country is developing in other parts of Europe as well. So the idea that the far right is the biggest threat to Europe, to the European Union, or the European project is not true. It comes from exactly the other side. Now, why does this matter, right? Why does this matter? Kind of this very often wrong information and this obsession with whether it's transgenderism or even the migration policies, because these things now start to bleed through into the areas of your daily lives. We talk about crime rates a lot on this show. We talk about other issues that can, that affect people in their daily lives. But today I want to look a little bit more at the economy, because this is also something I'm going to talk about with Doomberg later in the show. So kind of what's happening? Why are there these economic trends that seem to be so worrisome? And let's just look at this first graph that we have about Euro area manufacturing data and the indexes that we have. And as you can see here, it's a steep drop almost down to the level that was prevalent during COVID. So this is not a good sign. So kind of manufacturing in Europe is declining. So you might say, okay, fine, that's just one indicator. What's that mean? Do we really have to care? Well, let's look a little bit at the broader picture on the next graph. Well, we can see, this is from the Financial Times, well, we can see that productivity has risen much faster in the US than in Europe. And there you can see that in the early 2000s, 2005, the United States, Europe, and the United Kingdom were about the same. And then in 2010, approximately, right, the United States really started to take off. And you might wonder, why is that the case? And I just want to talk about this a little bit, because this will also be a more in detail topic in my conversation with Doomberg. Because the United States realized, more by coincidence than anything else, but of course they realized the necessity, the importance of energy for the economy. So if you, and this is why I always suggest that you watch this show and not just listen to it, because then you can see the graph and kind of the uptick in the US economy around 2010. And this is of course the fracking revolution. Right? Once it was said that hydraulic fracking is impossible, the idea was that by 2006, 2007, the United States will be a net energy importer. But what happened is they turned into a net energy exporter, because they had the technological innovation and the freedom within their country, particularly on the state level, like the federal government is problematic in this respect as well, that people could start fracking, right? That they could wrestle more energy from the ground, from the environment. And as you can imagine, if energy is cheap, everything else becomes cheaper as well. So while the Europeans, going back to what I said originally, right, the Europeans decided, and the British as well, to pursue ridiculous cloud cuckoo land, self-destructive environmental and energy policies, no nuclear energy, no coal, no gas, just wind and solar, right? Their economy stagnated. Whereas the United States, at least in some states, embraced the idea of fracking, embrace the idea of energy independence, of becoming an energy superpower. And of course, this is reflected in the GDP as well. So a lot of the negative things that we see happening in Europe at the moment, these are not like a meteor striking the world and unfortunately it hits Europe. These are the consequences of deliberate political decisions. Europe, Germany in particular, but other parts of Europe as well, has decided deliberately to pursue a suicidal policy in almost all aspects of life that matter. whether it was during COVID, whether it was in the matter of migration, whether it was in the matter of energy policy. All these policies, and they all were protected and are still shielded by a legacy and mainstream media that is not willing to accept and admit that they were wrong for at least 30 years. Now, look at this next graph, that gives you an impression of the share of Europe globally in both GDP and market capitalization of companies. It's a steep decline, right? And Europe is getting weaker. Europe is declining in almost every respect. And we need to talk about this, because when you hear European politicians about talking that Europe must be a counterweight to China, and Europe must counter the United States, and it needs to have strategic autonomy. Now, these are great ideas, but if you want to be a powerful player in the world, you have to be powerful. And in order to be powerful, you need a strong economy. You need independence in food production. You need independence in energy production. You need an intelligent political class. This is another element that always gives me nostalgia for the 19th century, because for all their flaws, I believe the Theodore Roosevelts and the Emperor Franz Josefs were actually much smarter than the political class we have nowadays. I know this is going to give me some criticism in the comments, but I admit this is how I feel about this. But these are all the elements you need in order to actually play a constructive role in global geopolitics. So we always hear these debates about what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East, and I think these are important conversations, important things. But we need to start doing our homework in Europe first. In many ways, I believe that Europe is kind of repeating the same mistake, in my opinion, that Russia is making, which is that if you're weak at home, you start to project force abroad because you think you can make up at mistakes that you did at the home front with adventurism abroad. But I think that is a mistake. There's often this idea, and I will have another interesting guest in the future to talk about this also in greater detail, but there's very often this idea that European power was a consequence of imperialism. I would propose to you that European imperialism was a consequence of European power. First, you get powerful internally, and then you can become an empire, right? Rome became an empire because the Romans were better organized, better structures, had better civil servants, had a better military than anybody around them. This is why they grew. Now, then, of course, there's a feedback loop, and these things feed into each other. But strength begins at home and not abroad. So this idea, whether it's Moscow or Brussels, this idea you get more powerful if you expand, is, I think, a mistaken way to look at this. We need to unleash the economic, innovative potential we have in Europe. And then maybe when we have done this, we can kind of engage in foreign adventures again. Look at this other graph that shows you kind of the role in export markets, where you see the same thing, right? There was a time when China, the United States, and the euro area were somewhat similar, kind of where they were more or less at the same level. Europe has declined. The world is no longer buying as many European goods and services as they did in the past. Right? People buy stuff from the United States and people buy stuff from China. Right? The Chinese, with a very shrewd economic policy, are outcompeting the Europeans. And so far, we do not have an answer to this problem. We do not have an answer to what's going on there. Let me show you another graph in the tech market. Now, if you look at the market value of tech companies in the world. Now, US tech companies, this is from 2016. They have a share of 69%, US tech companies. Asian tech companies have a share of 27%. European companies have a share of 4%. And African companies have a share of 1%. So Europe is kind of, the role of Europe in the tech sector is kind of closing in on the same role that Africa is playing. And that is a problem. And I don't think that the problem is that Europeans are less innovative. I don't think the problem is that Europeans have fewer ideas. I think all of this is there. But we have created an incentive system, a bureaucratic system, a regulatory system that disincentivizes everybody who has an idea. If you have a great idea, you go to the US. If you have a great idea, you might even go to Asia. You don't really want to stay in Europe. Why would you stay in Europe, where you pay high taxes, where you see declining services, where you see declining social cohesion that becomes less appealing as a place to raise your children on a lower income? Of course you're going to go somewhere else. So these things are connected. As I said before, the homework starts at home. Okay, we have to solve these domestic problems before we talk about anything else. And this goes back then to somebody like the crazy guy, Thierry Breton, who wrote the letter to Musk. Like an individual who thinks the great greatest thing Europe can do is regulating. We are regulating ourselves to death. We are regulating ourselves into oblivion. We are regulating ourselves into a third world country, a third world continent. And so these things do matter. I know sometimes these numbers and statistics, one could say, well, is it really 4%? Maybe it's 6%. And maybe, but what matters is the trend. Do you, and I'm asking this again as my European viewers and listeners, I mean, when you wake up in the morning, what do you feel about the future? Do you have a sense that Europe is on the ascent? Do you have a sense that tomorrow will be better than today? That the day after tomorrow will even be better than tomorrow? Or do you have a sense of anxiety? Do you have a sense that things tend to get worse and not better? I think that's your answer. You see the same yet in another graph that I want to show that's about electricity prices, because as I said originally, right, I think that the price of energy matters for almost everything. And you can see there again that the European countries, including the United Kingdom, compared to China and the US, it's too expensive. Right? Quite literally, turning a switch, turning on the light, is way more expensive in Europe or the United Kingdom than it is in China and the United States. No wonder that industry prefers to go there. Right? If turning on the coffee maker, if turning on your laptop already costs you almost twice as much here than it does over there, you have no incentive to stay here. And the last point that I believe we also have to talk about is the hours that are being worked. Right? This is my last graph for today, but I think it shows the same problem, which is the Europeans like to complain about that they work so much. They don't. Now, doesn't apply to everyone. There are many hardworking individuals out there. But overall, the amount of hours being worked is not as much as it was a couple of decades ago, and is not as much as in countries that we compete with. At the moment, the Germans work the lowest number of hours in any developed country. Yet in the same country, there is a debate about having mandatory the 4-day work week with a 5-day work week salary, in addition to over 4 weeks paid vacation and numerous holidays as well, which is, by the way, another great irony that the same people who say, oh, Europeans are an atheist secular society, they insist to stick to every religious holiday there is. It's a very odd thing that you're an atheist when it serves you, but apparently when it comes to a day of work, you become a very religious person all of a sudden again. So these are issues we have to deal and talk about within Europe, but also within the United States. Right? We need to work longer, we need to work harder, and we have to kind of deconstruct and get rid of a lot of the regulatory state. We have to rewire the incentive structure. And that's, I think, one of the most pressing issues we have. And all the institutions that are supposedly in place to make this happen have the opposite effect. Right? The European Union in its current shape and form, I believe, is an obstacle to unleash the creative powers in Europe. I think that those in charge, they want to maintain the status quo. They have no interest in a sense of a breakout, if you want, in a positive way, of European renewal. They just want to manage our decline. Right? I think many of them have simply made their peace with the fact that Europe is just going to be a second-rate power, a third-rate power, a no-name in global affairs. And I don't want this, because I believe in this continent. I believe that the world is a better place. In one of the future episodes, we're also going to talk more about demography. Right? We need to have more children again. I think the world will become a poorer place without Italians, without British, without French people, without Austrians, and yes, even without Germans, Hungarians, Poles, and all those others. And we'll have to talk about this in greater detail. A warning cry, I believe, must go through Europe. That being said, join me now for the second half of my conversation with Doomberg, where we're going to shed some more light on these kind of self-destructive and suicidal instincts that ail Europe. And if you enjoy this conversation, please jump over on Monday, which is August 19th, where the full 40-hour conversation will be up on Brussels Signal. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing all of you next week. Hello and welcome, and it's my great honor to welcome the team of Doomberg for the second podcast of Hammer Time. And I want to stay a little bit with the theme of today's show. So I began today's show with a quote from 1910, when supposedly, at least, Theodore Roosevelt met the then aging Emperor of Austria, Emperor Franz Joseph. And he asked the Emperor, what is the purpose of a monarch in the 20th century? And supposedly the aging Emperor said, it is my duty to protect my people from their politicians. And kind of this quote has kind of stuck with me a little bit. And you have written a lot in the past about energy. We had many conversations about this topic, but you have also ventured, which I'm very happy about, into the field of geopolitics, and you write very insightful about this as well. So I want to start a little bit. What is your assessment, if you would have to give one, about the current quality of leadership, both in the West and the competitors of the West?
Yeah, first of all, great to be back with you, Ralph. Always a pleasure. I would characterize the quality of the Western leaders as amongst the weakest we have observed in modern history, which is both unfortunate and, frankly, rather frightening. And I think they have cornered themselves geopolitically into a few situations that are stressing their leadership capabilities to the maximum and exposing fundamental flaws in Western society at a very inopportune time relative to our geopolitical opponents who, while not necessarily living in what we would call democratic societies, have leaders who are therefore allowed to think a bit more strategically and over longer time horizons as opposed to just the next election cycle. And I would say, given the situation in Ukraine and in the Middle East and in Taiwan, the West is in a very, very dangerous position. And we're seeing, as the incumbent leaders in the West grow more unpopular, they become a bit more desperate and a bit more authoritarian. And this is a very, very risky situation for freedom lovers in the West who believe in democracy and representative government and in fair play. And what we're seeing, for example, in the United Kingdom is downright scary. And those instincts, which I think are sort of similar to the way Justin Trudeau responded to the Freedom Convoys in 2022, which we wrote about quite harshly, I would say, but fairly. This is we're reaching a breaking point in the West, and something has to give. Either society as we understand it will no longer exist, or we will have to have a new slate of leaders with a different and perhaps a bit more realistic strategic outlook for the West.
You have once said, and this is something I take very much to heart, that you are an ideologue but not a partisan. And I think that's a very good way to look at this, because this is not really a left-right issue. This seems to me it's a free-unfree issue, because everything that current governments are attempting to do, once they're out of power, the other side can do it as well. So if we take the UK as an example, you might have a left-leaning government now, and they implement restrictions on freedom of speech. Now, if you have a shift in power and another party comes into office, well, they then, of course, can use the same laws, they can use the same means, and that would be true everywhere, wouldn't it?
Yes, and look, I'll give you a really shocking statistic, which is not getting enough play, I believe, as Keir Starmer embarks on a historic change to the British political system. I mean, let's call it what it is. He received roughly the same popular vote mandate as Marie Le Pen did in the last election, and yet he has a landslide victory in the UK parliamentary system, and Marie Le Pen has remained effectively boxed out of power in France. And I only make that comparison because to many people in the European Union, you know, Marie Le Pen is the French female equivalent of Orange Man Bad over here in the US, and they're doing everything in their power to keep her out of power, and yet she has roughly the same domestic popular support as the current quote-unquote left-leaning government in the United Kingdom, which I believe bears witness to the validity of the point you just made, which is one of the reasons why we object to such things, is because they will be used by whoever grabs the power next, and it might not be so pleasant to be on the other end of it when the quote-unquote right-leaning government takes control. Now, we should say some of the ugliest aspects of what we have seen in the UK, of course, are unfit for civil society and should be condemned and dealt with in a fair and appropriate way with all due protections. But at the same time, one does get the sense of a bit of political opportunism on the part of Keir Starmer to clamp down on social media platforms. And I would say that this crazy letter that was written to Elon Musk ahead of Donald Trump's appearance, warning Mr. Musk that, you know, Donald Trump's utterings cannot find their way to the ears of Europeans, as though European citizens are incapable of listening to a politician and coming to their own conclusions. It's really just crazy. The instincts of these people are scary, and by the way, this is not just the UK. Of course, very interesting developments going on in Germany with the shutting down of this, AFD adjacent magazine or whatever it is. These are all tools that will be used when the other side gets control. And I'll finish my answer by saying the root cause of this anger that we're seeing, really valve into the immigration issue or pick your favorite political hot button issue of the day. The real root cause of all of this anger is poor government, bad policies, in particular in energy. In democracies, people will not tolerate decreasing standards of living without some form of protest. And so until the policies are changed, this is only going to get worse. Sorry, go ahead.
No, exactly. I mean, as I can say, I pretty much have read everything they've written. And I think it's now almost 2 years ago, correct me if I'm wrong, that you have written a piece titled Crazy Pills about the sanctions policy vis-a-vis Russia. And in a recent podcast, you made, I think, a very keen observation, which was that the same people who implemented sanctions, economic sanctions, that revealed that they don't really understand energy markets, commodity markets, that if people fail in that area, how can we assume that they're experts or specialists or capable in any other area? And I think, would you argue, would it fair to say that this is currently revealed a little bit in all kinds of areas, in all issue fields, that we have a governing class, and I don't mean this in a conspiratorial sense, that is not as competent as one would wish?
Of course not. In fact, just this morning in the U.S., the now nominee for the Democratic Party, Kamala Harris, and that's a whole other story, is out saying that one of her platform issues is going to be passing a federal ban on price gouging by grocery store operators as a main way to fight food inflation. Now, last I checked, grocery store operators eke out a 2% margin. They barely are able to pass on their costs to the consumer, and they're basically a pass-through that is hyper-efficient and focused on volume. In what universe do price controls on food lead to abundant, cheap food? It's amazing to me, decades and decades and decades of failed experiments around the world trying to do the same thing, and nobody in the West seems to have learned these lessons. And so we have a competency crisis, and I believe the quote that you pulled from my prior podcast was, "Why would we believe we know what they're doing militarily?"
Exactly, yes.
And we see what's going on in Ukraine. And frankly, I don't know how it could be that Washington, D.C. thinks it could win a kinetic war against Russia with a supply chain thousands of miles away and also, by the way, heavily dependent on China. Once the mask comes off and you see through our lens of energy the competency crisis, it's hard to unsee it in every other domain.
I mean, one thing, you have left Twitter. I think you're just lurking on Twitter. You're not posting anything anymore, and you switched over to Substack, which is a fantastic platform. I can recommend all my listeners and viewers to check out the Doomberg Substack. But in general, this has really become a platform for informed discussion and informed contributions. But how would you view the role of for lack of a better term, of the legacy media in all of this? Because how can they get away with it? What you, for example, just mentioned about groceries. I mean, this is something that if somebody does due diligence as a journalist, right, that they can find it out. They can find out what actual profit margins are, what price controls potentially would do. Even to take the other side, they tried it in Hungary, and it's happened exactly what you said. Ultimately, at the end, grocery prices went up. So what they did is they put price controls on certain goods, butter and milk and eggs. So what then the supermarkets did, they just significantly increased prices because they had to make up for that elsewhere. But what's the role of journalism in this, or legacy journalism, traditional journalism? It seems that very often, and I do sense a bias there a little bit towards the left, but they let them get away with this, right? There's never any kind of critical question. I recently saw the commentator Ben Shapiro, and he's kind of keeping a little sign around on his show currently of the days Kamala Harris had to go without a serious question, and I think they're now on day 26. And again, I'm not trying to be partisan here, but it seems to me there is not even an interest in kind of nudging politicians into more competence because nobody's holding them accountable.
It's a great question, and I will begin by saying I believe, personally, that Google ruined the media business, and the sort of sputtering carcass that remains of what you and I would call the traditional media cannot afford to buy the talent needed to stand out in a modern world of the internet, where you have a totally free market like Substack, for example, where literally it is a merit-driven ecosystem. The best writers, the best edited pieces tend to rise as people share them and they get an audience. And by the way, if you lose the trust of your audience by making significant mistakes or saying something stupid, then the market will vote with its feet and will leave you. Google ruined the traditional media business because, it just, first of all, stole most of their content between Google and Facebook. It drained all of the revenue streams from these companies as they began to dominate the ad markets. And there's been successful antitrust lawsuits just against Google recently for trying to operate a monopoly in this regard. And then that meant, as revenues were shrinking for the traditional media, they had to delve into the clickbait, hollow, headline-driven stuff that you see in order to sell ads. And so if you look at, for example, a modestly successful Substack author, they're making oftentimes far more money than even a veteran journalist would be making doing it on their own. And we're aware of some people who are making life-changing money on Substack. We've certainly been able to create amazing things. And if you look at the Doomberg brand, we will be provocative without being polarizing. We'll be funny without being silly, and we will teach without being self-indulgent. And this is our brand ambition, and the market has voted. Our subscriber count validates that our work is not just clickbait-driven, but has substance. And we defend our work, and we often go back and admit when we got certain aspects of stories wrong. We have a philosophy that mistakes should be rare, admitted to, corrected, and learned from. This is all stuff that is missing from the national media. So how could it be that just a few months ago there were countless stories about how Kamala Harris was the least popular vice president of all time, and now she's on the cover of Time magazine, deified? And by the way, the whole Biden coup, I mean, none of this, could you imagine if this was happening under a Republican regime, how the media would be hyperventilating? And so it's the combination of things. I think Google ruined the media business, the hollowing out of the sector, and then what's left, of course, is sort of a self-reinforcing loop that mostly feeds the left in an echo chamber. There isn't much in the way of traditional conservative, libertarian-leaning media left.
But this is probably it, right? As you said, in many ways, and we see this in a wide array of areas, where it sometimes feels, and you mentioned this also in other podcasts, I think is one another saying of you that I like very much is that on the path from prosperity to poverty is riot. I'm botching it a little bit, but it's along these lines. That there seems to be a certain amount of gaslighting going on. And what I mean by this is, as you just mentioned, I mean, we were told, by the way, the same in European media as well. And again, I don't want to pile on one party or one side. It just happened to be the side that was in charge. That Joe Biden, it's the best Joe Biden there will ever be. Like he's the top of his game, and everything is fake news and deep fakes and cheap fakes and whatnot. And then all of a sudden it shifted. We were told in Europe, a topic that kind of led me to your writing in the first place, that the energy transition is just going to be amazing. It will all be wind, solar. It will be cheaper for everybody because the sun doesn't send a bill, the wind doesn't send a bill. We were equally told in the migration question, right? I mean, migration is a complex topic, but generally the argument was being made, however many people come, this is going to work out fine. There is no such thing as cultural cohesion as a necessary thing, and it's all just a right-wing scaremongering. I think we saw it partially also in the way governments approached the pandemic. I mean, this was a new situation that mistakes would be made. I think everybody would have understood this, but very often the politicians acted in a way as if they would know. They did not allow any kind of divergence from the path that they choose. And I wonder if it's not so much the issues itself, but the sum of feeling to use the term we used before, that it is an incompetent political class that makes people really, really angry. And then ultimately potentially becomes really a threat to democracy, because if you can no longer vote people into office who you feel are competent, there is a risk that at some point you say maybe the entire system is flawed and not just a politician running in it. So
here's a pet peeve of mine, which is you cannot mention any non-sort of mainstream political idea without being labeled by what's left of the traditional media as quote-unquote far right. Look what Trudeau did to the truckers, right? Calling them Nazis and the like. One of the things that is missing from the current slate of Western leaders, to return to your original question, is they often forget that once they're in office, it is their responsibility to lead all of the people and to listen to the legitimate complaints of all of the population. And like even here in the US, again, I'm no fan of Trump, but half the country is deeply passionate about the man. Perhaps we ought to take a step back and understand how that came to be. And in fact, the lower your opinion of Trump is, the more you should take a step back and ponder how it could be that half the country disagrees with you. Don't forget, I mean, he was elected president once, and he would argue the second election was a little bit fishy. But nonetheless, I mean, the vast majority of people who live in flyover country, for example, for whatever reason, are deeply passionate about Donald Trump. They believe that Donald Trump represents, perhaps, the last great hope for saving the U.S. as they remember it. Now, you might think that's foolish. You might think that's stupid. Why does half the country think that is a question that nobody wants to ponder. They're just bad people. Well, you can't be a leader of a democracy and say that half of the people are bad. Like, look what's going on in Germany. Again, AfD is what? Polling in the high 30s, low 40s in the what used to be Eastern Germany. Mm-hmm. Well, this is something that needs to be handled. That's something that needs to be, and not in the way that it's currently being handled by the Interior Ministry, whatever her name is. Her name escapes me now because I'm not super familiar with Germany's domestic politics. I only see what I see on Substack, frankly. But how could it be that 40% of East Germany is intending to vote for a party that the traditional media says is way out of bounds? Okay. I mean, that party could be way out of bounds. I don't know. But the fact that 40% of people in East Germany are supporting them is something that needs to be contemplated in a mature way, with open discourse and debate. Okay, maybe we got some policies wrong. What are those policies, and how can we shift them to regain the trust of the 40% who feel so desperate that they're voting for the quote-unquote out-of-bounds party? And in fact, the lower your opinion of the AfD, the more you should be concerned about the answer to that question and what you should be doing differently in order to circumvent this quote-unquote risk to democracy.
If you would like to hear the full conversation with Doomberg, please jump over to Brussels Signal. The link is provided in the description, and enjoy the conversation where we touch on many more additional topics.